If everybody could grab a seat. Thank you all. Does somebody have a glass they can clink? Awesome. Why does that work so well? I'll never understand that. All right, we have a great panel. I'm going to leave it to Ali Solis to get us kicked off. She's our incoming chair, our vice chair, and one of the people I rely on so regularly. And we have a great panel, so I'm looking forward to hearing from you all.
Thank you so much, David. How's everybody doing? You know, the afternoon panel, a little tired, need some coffee, get up, stretch. You're in for a treat today. My name is Ali Solis, as David mentioned, and during the day I run a small advisory services firm. But today we're, at NHC, our focus is really on cultivating affordable housing solutions and best practices and putting forward ideas that are about solving America's housing crisis. And many of you are probably familiar, because you're in this room today, so you're either familiar with or interested in learning more about single-family rental and the issue of investor-owned housing across the country. There's been a lot of headlines and recent narratives that, narratives capture audiences in this world where we have, 3 seconds to sort of pay attention to what's happening in the news and in the country. And it's easy to put together a simple villain and a narrative around sort of greedy corporate investors and others. But I think the complexities of the housing crisis and what we're here to talk about today is sort of, getting to some of those myths and facts, and also really focusing on what National Housing Conference does all the time, and that is sort of what are the solutions? What are the solutions out there that are going to best strive and address the biggest crisis we're facing, which is that we simply do not have enough homes that meet people at all affordability levels in this country. So today our panelists vary from esteemed researchers and leaders in the country. I think you've got access to all their bios, so I won't spend a whole lot of time. We also have community leaders here, and really we want to dig into some of the issues. But to set the stage for both the current market conditions that we're facing in this country, but also what the data has been telling us, and getting to some of those myths versus facts, it's my pleasure to turn it over to Lori to kick us off.
Well, thank you very much, and thanks so much for having me here today. I'm going to spend about 10 minutes just sort of setting the stage for this panel. And I'm going to make a number of points in this presentation. First, the U.S. has a severe housing supply shortage, particularly at the more affordable end of the market. Single-family investors are not the cause of the supply shortage. The single-family share has been relatively constant through time, and I think some of these numbers will amaze you. Third, mega SFR investors are a very small part of the overall market, but have a significant presence in some metro areas. Mega single-family rental operators tend to buy newer, larger, more upscale homes, and they tend to put considerable money into repairs. While we know there's a lot that we don't know about the behavior of mega investors versus smaller investors. And in terms of policy implications, we strongly believe that size should bring obligations to try to improve the tenant experience. There are items that larger operators could provide very economically, and they should be required to do so, and many of them already are. So in terms of the fact that we have a severe housing supply shortage, Freddie Mac estimated in 2021 we had a shortage of about 5.8 million units. Jim Parrott and Mark Zandi estimated a shortage of about 1.7 million units. Both Zandi and Parrott was based solely on vacancy data. Freddie Mac was based on both vacancy data plus households that weren't formed. The National Association of Realtors showed that there's 5.5 million fewer homes built from 2001 through 2020 versus the 3 prior decade per annum average. Another way to look at this is population-adjusted housing production. If you look at this figure at the very bottom of the page, you can see that we've been producing about sort of the last year or so, it's been about 5.1 homes per 1,000 population. If you go back to the 1960s, 1970s, 1980s, we were producing about 8 homes per 1,000 population. Obviously, we're up from the lows after the great financial crisis, but we are simply not producing enough homes. And affordability issues are especially acute at the lower end of the market. This just shows you house price appreciation by price tier. And you can see from 2000 to 2023, the inflation was about 77%. The low-end homes, the low-price tier homes, were up by 351%. That is, you'd be at 177% just based on inflation. It's been way, and even the highest tier homes are up by 264%. So home price appreciation has been very robust, period. It's been more robust at the lower end of the market just because of the shortage of affordable listings. And if you look at the right-hand side of this page, this just shows you active listings by price tier over time, and you can see how much the share of homes under 200,000 has shrunk over time. It's just been amazing how much that has shrunk over time. So very few homes are really affordable to lower income individuals. Well, now let's turn to looking at, so the number one problem is we simply don't have enough housing. And now I'm going to make you the case that single-family rental operators are not the reason for this. If you look at the single-family share of all rental units, it's been pretty constant through time. You know, it was at about 31%. It went up to about 35% after the great financial crisis. It's now down to about 31.5%. So basically, the single-family share of all rental units has been fairly constant through time. If you look on the right-hand side of the page, this shows you the rental occupied share of housing units. So overall, rentals are about 34.8% of all housing units. In the single-family world, they're about 13.7% of all housing units. That is about a little bit over 86% are owner occupied. So the single-family rental share is now very close to historical levels. If mega operators were taking over the world, you would assume that this share would be rising. So when you look at investor purchases, and this is based on CoreLogic data, you can see that investor purchases are about 25% of all purchases. However, when you look at this information by size of the investor on the right-hand side of the page, what you find is that it's mostly medium and small and medium investors. Small investors are defined as 3 to 10 units, medium investors 10 to 100, large are defined as 100 to 1,000, and mega is over 1,000 using CoreLogic data. So you can see that the bulk of the market is actually the small and medium investors. And you'll also observe that if investors were really purchasing 25% of all properties and never selling, that the share of rentals would be rising over time, and in fact, it's not, which suggests that whatever investors are purchasing in the aggregate, there's a roughly equal amount of selling, although there has been a move over time from smaller investors to larger investors. The 32 mega investors, defined as those that own at least 1,000 properties and operate in at least 3 markets, comprise about 3% of all single-family rentals, 3% nationwide. However, the mega investors are highly concentrated. They own 27% of the single-family rentals in Atlanta, 22% in Jacksonville, 20% in Charlotte, 16% in Tampa, and 15% in Phoenix. So 3% of the overall market, but much, much larger in certain MSAs. Mega investors tend to own newer properties in the markets in which they're concentrated. That is, their year built is 1993 versus 1979 for all rentals. So they're not buying old properties that are very, very run down. They tend to be buying newer properties. Institutional SFR operators tend to buy larger units than other single-family rentals. 37% of single-family rental properties nationwide had 2 or fewer bedrooms versus 4% of the mega operators. So they tend to buy higher-end properties. Now let's look at some additional facts about mega investors. They tend to target neighborhoods with above-average renter income. The median renter income of the top 20 MSAs where the mega investors were the most active was $45,000. It was $53,000 in the census tracts within the MSA where the mega operators are the most active. So again, median income for the census tracts within the MSA of the renter census tracts within the MSA, 45,000, 53,000 where the mega operators are the most active. They tend to generally operate in neighborhoods with a racial composition that mirrors the MSAs in which they're located. They tend to be marginally overrepresented in Black neighborhoods and marginally underrepresented in Latino neighborhoods. This may reflect the fact that the initial purchases for many of the mega operators were made in the wake of the great financial crisis, where so many of the foreclosures were unfortunately concentrated in Black neighborhoods. Mega SFR operators tend to target homes that need repair. Invitation Homes, in their 10K, they said they spent about $35,000 repairing each home they purchased in 2021. American Homes for Rent said they spent between $20,000 and $40,000. We figure the average new homeowner spends about $6,300. Repairs are extraordinarily hard to finance. Amherst has estimated that 85% of the renters in Main Street Renewal would not qualify for a mortgage due to credit score or income constraints. So these are not, essentially, the renters are not the same population that would be home buyers. Now let's look at what we know and don't know about mega investor behavior. In terms of the impact on home prices and rents in the area, mega investors tend to target fast-growing areas for better return. So these are areas in which prices and rents would increase more than the nationwide average. So you see, well, gee, home prices are up in neighborhoods where institutional investors are concentrated. Yes, that's true, because the investors tend to target these neighborhoods. So it's hard to determine how much they've actually contributed to home price appreciation or rent appreciation in the area. CoreLogic does something where essentially they look at whether investor purchases of single-family homes tend to lead or lag rent appreciation. And what they find is that single-family home purchases by mega investors tends to lag home price appreciation, tends to lag rent appreciation. That is, the large operators come into areas where rents are already rising very rapidly, because these are, again, areas where the city is growing, population is growing, employment is growing. In terms of management of delinquent tenants, we know that mega operators tend to send out more eviction notices as a rent collection technique. However, it's unclear if they evict more. There is zero data on actual evictions. So when people say SFR operators do more evictions, what they mean is they do more eviction filings. You don't know whether they do more evictions or not. Most eviction filings do not result in evictions. My guess is at the end of the day, they probably do less because they target a more affluent group of tenants. However, it's important to realize that eviction notices can be damaging to tenants even if there is no eviction. In terms of screening, I wanted to actually, in terms of rent increases, I forgot to show one other slide that I had wanted to show, and that is, we do know mega investors tend to have increases that are slightly above other investors, but not a whole lot above. And then what you see is that they're more responsive to changes in market rents. That is, if you look at average price increases since 2015, mega investors have raised rents by 5.2% per annum versus rent ranges, three-bedroom number of around 4.7% and four-bedroom number of around 4.4%. So, but you'll also notice that mega operators tend to be much more responsive to the market. When rents are going up, they tend to raise rents more. When rents are softer, they tend to lower rents or have much more muted increases. In terms of screening, mega investors tend to rely more heavily on screening algorithms rather than gut feeling. They'll check previous evictions, criminal history, and often credit scores. They very rarely meet the potential tenant, as opposed to a smaller mom and pop investor who will tend to meet the tenant. In terms of the tenant experience, there's no data whatsoever on whether larger investors do a better or a worse job on maintenance. The larger investors tend to rely on in-house property management operations. They have staff available 24/7, and they've incorporated technology in the maintenance process where the repairs can be done very efficiently. However, the lack of a personal connection may make it harder for the landlord to understand what the tenant actually needs and for the tenant to hold the landlord accountable. Policy suggestions for the single-family rental industry. First, there should be rental registries, either required at every local level or at the national level, with transparency as to ultimate ownership. We should know who ultimately owns the homes. Larger investors, because of their scale, can more easily do certain items to improve the tenant experience than smaller investors. They can report rent to the credit bureaus. They can accept housing choice vouchers. They can accept security deposit insurance in lieu of security deposits. They can disclose fees in a more transparent manner before the borrower signs a lease. They can give notice to tenants prior to an eviction filing. So these are things that larger investors can do more cheaply than smaller investors simply because of their scale, and I would argue they should be required to do that. And finally, improve renovation financing for owner occupants. Again, if you walk into a home where you can imagine your curtains on their windows, that is not the home the institutional investors are buying. The home they're buying needs significant repair, and our renovation system is in very bad shape in this country. I'm very glad FHA is looking to improve the 203K program. It definitely needs to be done, and a lot more needs to be done to make renovation financing more attractive for owner occupants. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Lori. That gives us a great, I think, overview for the discussion today. And let's start with some of the points you made in terms of institutional investors. You mentioned that they are a small part of the overall ownership of the SFR market. What has happened, and I'll open this up to the entire panel, but what has happened to the supply of single-family residential homes as a result, as institutional investment has increased over time? Let's talk about sort of the market and how the pandemic has really impacted the SFR market. Whoever wants to take that first.
I'd be happy to start off. Nish Usud, and I work at Pretium, which is one of the larger holders of single-family rentals in the U.S. Lori's presentation did, I think, a fantastic job of laying a fact-based groundwork for kind of thinking about this topic. So single-family rentals have always been a part of the U.S. housing landscape. I would argue they're a very important part of the U.S. landscape, U.S. housing landscape. And I say that because, opportunity, and Harvard's Opportunity Insights Center has done great work on this. A lot of, resident and household opportunities derive from where someone grows up, and a lot of opportunities in the U.S., because of the way that housing patterns have historically developed, have been concentrated in single-family neighborhoods. So having, and the JCHS from Harvard has described single-family suburban neighborhoods as rental deserts. So having rental access to single-family neighborhoods, I think, is a very important part of making sure that there's not only access, but choice and affordability. And I know we'll talk a little bit more about that later. But to get to the one of the most surprising things, I think, factually, if you look at single-family rentals over the last couple of years where there's been a real, I think, white-hot focus on the sector, the number of single-family rentals over the last few years has actually been going down. And this is very surprising to most people when I talk about it. Lori showed a great chart from CoreLogic that showed that investor buyer activity has gone up, but on the other side of that is that a lot of investors tend to sell homes back into the homeownership market, and that activity has actually been greater than the amount of homes that have been purchased in recent years. So if you look at, and again, Lori's idea about, Lori and her co-author, Ingrid Goldell, and their idea about having rental registries would provide us data on this, which I think would be great in terms of really understanding this topic better. But the best available data that we have does suggest that the supply of single-family rentals has actually gone down in the last couple of years, even in markets like Atlanta, which I think where obviously a lot of institutional activity has been concentrated.
Chris, go ahead.
Yeah, I'll jump in. Christopher Tyson with the National Community Stabilization Trust. And NCST has always been focused on homeownership and viewing homeownership as a way to stabilize neighborhoods and close the racial wealth gap. And so we herald all of the progress that we've made on the demand side for homeownership. And we just heard about special purpose credit programs. We know that down payment assistance has increased across the country. We see a lot of changes with regards to credit requirements that will bring more families, particularly families of color, into the opportunity for homeownership. And we're seeing that at a time where we're seeing a diminishing supply available for those families to choose from when they go into the market looking, for homeownership opportunities. So in that context, right, and particularly in certain markets like Atlanta and others, we've all read the headlines about single-family rental investor activity and how that appears to be concentrated, as the research shows, in neighborhoods of color. So there's a concern there, and I think a valid one, about what are the impacts, particularly on the communities that we most want to see an opportunity, have an opportunity to move into homeownership, those who have been systematically excluded or had their path to homeownership made very difficult by policy and market activity. We know that story well. So I think that's the context we kind of view this conversation. We certainly hear anecdotally from our community buyers across the country that in their particular markets, they're viewing this investor or mega investor activity, as Lori rightly distinguished. And I think it is important to distinguish between mom and pops and mega investors. But that they're seeing this activity in their markets and are connecting it to a shrinking opportunity, both for the end owner-occupant purchaser, but also for the nonprofits and mission-driven developers who are often in the middle of that process. And particularly when we find, with the case of distressed and defaulted mortgage property, which is also something that NCST has focused on. So, we champion homeownership. We recognize that single-family rentals have always been a part of the housing mix and will continue to be a part of the housing mix, and for good reason. But as we focus on homeownership, we're very concerned about the diminishing supply and all of the many factors, including investor activity, that may contribute to that.
I want to turn to John for 1 second, but before I do that, I think one of the things I want to talk about is like concentration as compared to what, right? So if you're living in a neighborhood, it feels very personal, and often it is, if you're starting to see that that's happening. But I think the issue, and Shekhar mentioned this earlier for those that were here on the multifamily panel, we tend to get into this zero-sum discussion, right? Where really the real issue is around the supply and the huge need that we have to address housing at all income levels. But I want to hear from John, because you talked about the roles that nonprofit plays, and you're in the community, you're in Atlanta. Tell us about the role that you're doing there.
Yeah, so Atlanta's ground zero, and real estate is personal and local. So I think there are mixed results. Urban's done some great research, and one of that research is, wow, this industry is incredibly efficient. You would rather, I think, be a resident for services and others for one of these groups than if our not-for-profit were doing our own property management, because there is an advantage to scale, right? And so there is an efficiency. In Atlanta, the single-family rental used to be owned by rich doctors and lawyers. And then when, depending interest rates and everything else, they might buy more, and then they might sell it to another doctor, lawyer, or they might sell it to a homeowner. So I might disagree. I need to see the facts that investor properties are going to homeowners. I think in Atlanta, we built a bunch of luxury rentals. So as a share of the overall housing market, single-family rental has gone down. But for today, good operators, and we've got 3 here. It's like Pretium's big in Pretium, is big in our market. They've given us access as a not-for-profit. We want to own it so that when it appreciates, right, we can turn it into home ownership or use not-for-profit. When investors own it, right, you get a maximum value, you have to raise rents or you sell it at a higher level. So we are now partnering with Mind. We've got some local operators, but we're looking for that. How do you buy the right home and use the technology that this industry has? How do you get the right rehab that will be weather resistant and everything else? But how do you do it as a not-for-profit? And so we've scaled what we own from some donation homes from Thank You Chase, Thank You Bank of America, to now we've got a portfolio of 235, still very small. And we're trying to start adding hundreds, 100 next year, not hundreds, but to get up where we could have some scale and convert. So let me say, first, thanks for this. So it's a third of rental housing. All is not-for-profits, and everyone talks about preservation of rental housing. I'm glad we're talking about single family. And thanks to the industry players that are here, because we need you at the table. But there's going to be some healthy tension. We want to maximize home ownership, and some of what the industry does is fabulous, and some we need to work on those outcomes. Like, can we do first look sales to not-for-profits? How do we get partnerships? And if we don't know one another, we aren't going to work together.
It's a really good point, and we're going to move to solutions in a little while. Lori, I wanted to just let you get in here for a second.
Yeah, so I wanted to make a couple quick points, basically sort of echoing some of the thoughts that have been made. So, you know, Chris brought up the overall tight supply, which is a huge problem. And one of the ways that nonprofits have actually gotten in over the last decade or so has been through foreclosure sales. And you know, we're all happy to see less foreclosure sales, but it makes your life much, much harder. Certainly that was also the initial route in for many of the institutional investors. Second, I want to point out that the market for for single-family institutional renters really didn't exist before 2012. Invitation Homes started buying homes in 2012. That was the beginning of the market. It's now 3% of the overall market. Again, so basically they've taken market share from the smaller and medium-sized investors, as John mentioned, from the doctors and lawyers who used to own these homes have sold out. And I also want to point out that echoing John's point on the unbelievable efficiency of these operators in terms of being able to do both repairs and maintenance.
So while the share hasn't really increased of single-family rentals across the country, the increase has been in these mega investors being able to purchase more from the mom and pops. And let's talk about why in some ways that can be a good thing. And just to illustrate the point you mentioned, John, that some of the capacities that the larger institutional investors, these mega investors have are around property management or technology uses. And so, as we start to think about housing affordability challenges and these overall solutions, I'd love to hear from, not to put you on the spot, Nishu, but what are some of the ways that you all bring to scale solutions, whether they are around property management or helping resident services, support systems. You can do that more when you have a portfolio of tens of thousands of units. So talk a little bit about the innovations that are happening in the industry that actually can benefit both residents and communities.
Sure. So it's a very young industry, and joining it, it's pretty dynamic. It's changing, I think a lot over time and improving. I mean, on the maintenance side, we, for example, try to accomplish more than half of calls that we get internally. And that's very good for a resident because we obviously have our own fleet of trained professionals who basically, they have a route that they follow each day, and we can schedule that very efficiently. And their trucks are specifically equipped with the tools or the parts for the most common repairs that are going to come up. So that's one way. And also, if you can submit your repair, send some pictures online, and again, this is all part of recent developments in the industry, that is a better experience, I think, for most tenants than to be able to, to have to call someone, to have to describe it, to figure it out. Then another party usually has to come in. So obviously, if it's a roofing problem, we still have to call an outside person, or something like that. But we're trying to make it as seamless as possible, so that the tenant experience is good. Other things which we've taken up in recent years is our partnership with Isuzu, for example. So all of our tenants are able to opt in to having rent reporting so that it can improve their credit rating. That program has been very successful. My colleague Tatiana is here. She can give you all the details about that. But thousands of residents have established credit scores for the first time. So those are the scale. It can we're thinking about how can we implement solar. If you look at the way that solar is installed in most residential neighborhoods at the moment, it's house by house. These companies are spending up to a third of what they take in just trying to reach the homeowner in order to, or the landlord in order to be able to try to complete a project. We're piloting installing it on several hundred of our homes and then seeing if we can figure out how to do it at scale. So there's a lot of benefits to scale, and how can we help others in terms of managing houses that are scattered is very difficult, right? Like, it's a lot more difficult than managing an apartment building. So how can we even export some of those skills to work with, let's say, a not-for-profit or a public housing authority that may have a portfolio of homes? So there's a lot of interesting ideas and things that we've done so far, and I think there's a lot more, I think, to come to.
And just to add on to that, it's not all investors are the same. We've heard that from the categories of mega investors to small investors. But back to the issue of information and what exists, for many residents, they don't know who their investor is. Frankly, they don't care. They just want to be able to call somebody and get their toilet fixed, right? So I think the issue of ensuring that there's access for residents to be able to understand who their landlords are and be able to get to that information more quickly, and perhaps sharing the tools of the economies of scale that some of the mega investors have learned from with the broader industry, I think could be a valuable resource. And I know, Chris, your organization has worked with many homeowners and with properties, as you mentioned, vacant properties, in terms of turning them back into effective use for homeownership programs. As we think about the affordability challenges in our country, particularly that have grown since the pandemic, and we've got obviously mortgage rates rising rapidly, what is the impact, would you say, on homeownership? You talked about those challenges that we're facing. So one may look at the single-family investor as being a challenge to homeownership opportunities. What are you seeing across the country?
Well, I think your earlier point is correct, right? The challenge is the lack of supply, right? And so I think it's right to clarify that there's not necessarily a direct causality between single-family investor activity and the lack of supply. We know there are a host of issues around the lack of supply. We haven't built enough housing, right? We have tremendous issues with zoning and other areas that complicate the production of new housing. NCST has always been focused in the housing aftermarket. So how do we take distressed and defaulted mortgage property and bring it back to market in ways that support the expansion of homeownership? And we know that most of our housing is built before 1980. So the issue around repairs and changes to the 203K program is a big issue in giving potential homeowners more opportunities to access those homes. Affordable homeowners are more likely going to get an older home as their entry into home ownership. There may be repairs that have to be done on that home to make it habitable, or at least kind of suit modern tastes with regards to homes. Those are the issues that I think we're seeing with our community buyer base around the country, which includes people like John, who's also a board member of NCSD as well. And I think some of that changes based on what market you're in. And we do kind of hear different concerns based on what's going on in one market versus the other.
Lori's data suggested it was about $6,000 that an individual homeowner pays in terms of repairs, where institutional investors are doing somewhere in the upwards of 20 to 40, depending on the
Yeah.
age of the housing stock. You mentioned this program 203K. For us, housing geeks that have been around for a while, they may know what that means, but perhaps others in the audience aren't familiar with the 203K program at FHA. Does anybody want to speak to that? It's been out of commission for some time, or certainly not. I shouldn't say that. Julia Gordon's people's going to throw things at me, but getting to scale. But you want to say a little bit about 203K and what made it an opportunity?
So the 203K program is FHA's renovation program. The way it's structured is if you're going to do under 35,000 or only non-structural under 35,000 of totally non-structural repairs, you do not need a HUD consultant. Over 35,000 or any structural repair, you need a HUD consultant. So it makes it fairly cumbersome. The denial rate on renovation loans is on the order of 40%. So I am a homeowner. I'm selling a home that needs repair. Nishu walks in with his homeowner bid, and Chris walks in with a cash bid for $2,000 less. I'm going to take Chris's bid because the potential denial rate is just so high. So it's a cumbersome program. FHA is looking at streamlining it. Ultimately, you've got to think about whether the responsibility for doing repairs should. And the GSEs also have repair programs as well. And their programs, there's no need for a consultant, but the lender usually absorbs the. GSEs have recourse to the lender until the repair is done, so the lender is essentially absorbing the risk, which most lenders don't want to do. So those programs aren't highly functional either. So we really have no renovation financing system for owner-occupants in this country that works.
There are some state housing finance agencies that are using programs like the HOME program and CDBG dollars to do that, but not to scale, and certainly not addressing the larger needs of the number of people in need. Go ahead, Chris.
And as someone who managed home repair in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, managing that city's CDBG and home portfolio, those programs, depending upon a host of local policy factors and local capacity issues, can be very cumbersome to administer and very challenging as well. So there's a whole area of renovation financing that needs a lot of attention. I echo Lori's sentiments about being excited that FHA is tackling that, and we're on the edge of our seat to see what the outcome is.
That's great. Anybody else on?
Yeah, I'll just add on the renovation and talk about supply. Our little not-for-profit is the #1 seller of entry-level homes. Our best work is when we got homes from Chris or another source, and we rehabbed it, right? And we may be able to bring in some charitable money or New Markets tax credit or capital magnet, and we sold it to a homeowner with our down payment and maybe down payment from a bank. So there are system ways to get at it aside from the 203K. That is today in Atlanta the cheapest home. So how do you get that home? Because the new construction home, unless we make it very small, is very expensive. So we need to do smaller new build and keep getting that rehab capacity. In Atlanta, most heavy investor market. Now investors are trading among one another. It's no longer they're getting the home out of foreclosure or whatever. If somebody's got it for sale, it's now a trade within these players, and we need to make sure the better players win. And we'll talk to solutions where to use vouchers or partnerships.
Yeah, I think there's a lot we can focus on in that space. There's an increasing number of new single-family homes that are being built specifically for the purpose of rental. So either built for rent, BFR, if you've heard of that term, or single-family rentals in this country in general. What does this trend mean for the home building industry and for housing supply overall?
I'll start there. So first of all, built for rent is a single-family home where the developer or the builder has designated this home is going to be a rental. And some stats to frame it there. There's been more interest in it recently because the single-family rental industry has attracted more institutional capital. So there's a lot of capital trying to now build homes specifically for rent. I think on an overall perspective, if the root cause of a lot of affordability issues, or really the root cause of the affordability issue, is that enough housing hasn't been built to attract more capital, to build to rent specifically will help builders to build more. And a couple examples I can think of specifically. Sometimes builders will have a very large development, right? And there might be 5 different phases of it. And if they can identify one of those phases and say that this will be the rental, part of the community, that will help them to get through that project quicker. And that is very important to a developer or builder to make sure that they can get through that community quickly. Sometimes there might be parcels of land which for some reason or the other are more suitable to being a rental community. A homeowner might not want to make the trade-off, for example, of proximity to something, I don't know, a railway or something, or to retail or to something else. But for a rental a household, the trade-offs are different. And so it might be best suited for that. So that's a parcel of land that would get developed that otherwise might not have, right, or in a different form than it would have. So overall, I think that as the build-to-rent side of things continues to develop, it should encourage more development of housing, which I think goes to the root cause of affordability. Now, we are pretty far off of having balance between how many single-family homes are being built for rent, and how many are being currently used for rent. And the stats are somewhere around 16 or 18% of single-family houses are used as rentals at the moment, but only about 5 to 8% of new single-family houses are built as rentals. So if we didn't have investors, whether it be mom and pops or larger groups, buying individual existing homes from homeowners, the stock of single-family rental supply would naturally go down, would have basically of what it is at the moment. So there's a lot of room, I think, to have an expansion of investment that goes into build-to-rent communities. I think it would just help the overall affordability situation.
Go ahead, Laura.
Yeah, so I just want to echo everything that Nishu said. It's absolutely right. It's important to realize that the same home is not a built-to-rent home and a built-for-sale home. The built-to-rent homes tend to be smaller. There's less customization. It's more standard. You try to squeeze some costs out of the process. In a lot of cases in build-to-rent communities, there are some zoning variances that are given in order to make the lot size a little bit smaller and things like that, which all goes to the point that essentially build-to-rent increases supply that would not have otherwise been there, and I think that's just the critical point. I also think that the amount of build-to-rent supply is a little bit understated. In the census says, what is this home built for rent or built for sale? And about 7% is built for rent. I actually think the number is a little bit higher because it doesn't capture some of the builder sales that are pre-contracted, where the home was built for the home is delivered after the certificate of occupancy is on the home, and it's delivered to a rental operator later. I think that is not totally captured in the census number. So I think the number is actually closer to 12%.
So one thing I continue to hear is the need to get our data smarter, better,
Yes, it
more
would be nice
clear.
to know what that real number is, but I think it's actually somewhat higher than the 7%.
Yeah, and I think one of the things we always want to be mindful of, right, is some of the equity impacts of these types of activities. Where we're building homes for rent, we're likely building them where land is cheap. That's likely in neighborhoods of color. That's likely in the vicinity or in proximity to homeowners of color who already face significant challenges with gaining appreciation in their properties. Wealth creation in black neighborhoods with homeowners does not work the same as it has for other groups, right? We see lower appreciation levels, and that can be a drain on family wealth creation. It can stigmatize those neighborhoods, and if we're seeing that, these neighborhoods are perceived to be places, where cheaper rental housing is coming in, is that going to have cause a further drag on home values in those neighborhoods for owners that exist, who are already, likely challenged by lower appreciation rates for their property in the marketplace. So just something that I think we want to be mindful of. I don't know if we have any data at this point about what that may look like, but certainly questions I think we should want to ask and things we should want to track.
Do we have any data around the impact on property values for those neighborhoods where there may be a higher amount of single-family rentals? Are we, anything that we could point to as a trend, Lori, or issue?
I mean, there's been, I think, a lot of studies done of it, and the studies have reached both conclusions, I think. One is that investors, I think the more common narrative you will hear is that investor buying drives home prices up. And then in some other studies, there's also the question been asked, does investor, because any rental is owned by an investor, right? So the other topic that's been studied is, does investor buying lower property values? So I think it really speaks to what Lori mentioned earlier. We don't even know what the number of investor buyers is. Like the CoreLogic numbers, which Lori helpfully showed earlier, those are the most common numbers. But I've seen numbers as low as the NAR calculated in 2021 that only 13% of homes were bought by investors. Freddie Mac said it was calculated. These are all very, very good research departments, right? Freddie Mac calculated at 28, so we have a range. And even in terms of when that buying activity peaked, the NAR and Freddie Mac concluded it was in 2013 or 2014, and then CoreLogic and Redfin, who also have a very good research department, concluded it was in 21. I'm just saying those numbers because it just shows you how hard it is to really understand what's going on. Even as simple of a question of, does investor buying drive home prices down, or does it drive it up? Does it depend on the neighborhood, right? Does it depend on the city? Depend on the time period? What's happening to mortgage rates? I mean, it's really hard to get answers on a lot of this stuff.
And baseline, we don't even have the same definitions, right? The way we describe investors is different definitions.
Everyone's got a different definition, and you also have, everyone's got a different definition.
So let's move to federal policy solutions. I want to get at some of the things you talked about, Christopher, around equity and wealth building, the pathway to homeownership, which has been so critical for lower income families, where that asset and wealth creation has been incredibly important. Renters, we're seeing the change. I'm dealing with my parents, aging parents, by the way, who are looking perhaps to find a smaller home. Those don't exist either. So they're moving into my house, by the way. So again, in terms of the supply that's needed across the country and the solutions that we need to address affordability, but also to ensure that we have pathways for homeownership, should that be what people want. How are we thinking about the supply that's needed to meet people where they are? Seniors like my parents, new homeowners who used to be able to buy the $200,000 or $150,000 VA starter home. Those don't exist right now. So in the absence of that, some build for rent kinds of models may be a good way, but is there a way to perhaps create better pathways to homeownership? And are any of you working in that capacity right now?
Sure, so I'll jump in. One of the ways is to increase the supply of affordable homes, right? And so we know that in many cities we have vacancy issues, and there are market reasons why those homes are sitting vacant and unrenovated, and the valuation gap between what it costs to repair those homes and what those homes are actually going to appraise for is an issue. I'll make the commercial for the Neighborhood Homes Investment Act at this point,
Yes.
right? Which, as John knows, right, it still has some work that we need to do. It doesn't solve all of the problems, but it does give us an opportunity for a LIHTC scale solution to the valuation gap that will create more affordable units in many markets. And it's a great starting point, I think, for focusing us on how do we get all of this, kind of dormant supply that's sitting around in cities like Baltimore. We have a pilot program in Baltimore to support emerging developers to rehab vacant properties. We're finally kind of seeing some traction with those homes selling, and so it is a model that we look forward to continuing to scale. But I think Neighborhood Homes Investment Act is one. A lot of the changes happening at FHA are another. We need to change home regs so that the home program can support home ownership more. I think there are a number of policy solutions that we should be focused on.
And by the way, for those that are interested in learning more about the Neighborhood Homes Investment Act, it's a policy priority of the National Housing Conference. We have a coalition. I'm happy to have you. It's a bipartisan legislation that's moving forward. There might be perhaps some ways to think about the efficiencies when Neighborhood Homes gets enacted, when Congress starts to do some bipartisan legislation and actually move it, sidebar, then we could also look at how we might expand and bring the capacities of the investors in to figure out how we can scale some of that rehab to bear. But go ahead, John.
Yeah, as a local practitioner, I'll point out, we aren't doing $1 million apartments for LIHTC in Atlanta, but we're doing 350,000. There are single-family homes that we're developing, acquisition and rehab or new construction for 250 to under 300,000. The amount of subsidy that is needed to create a below 80%, even a below 60% AMI buyer for those that have great credit, because in Atlanta we got a lot of black families that have great credit, but they can't find product. So the amount of subsidy for that market is a fraction of what's needed, right? We need both programs to be successful. So we use New Markets tax credits. We use capital magnet funds. Getting those programs to get more than 1% of their total to home ownership is sort of our goal. We're working through NCST and others. And then the goal is, can you find a national program? Now, I was at an early organizing for Neighborhood Homes Investment Act. If I thought it might be passing this Congress, I wouldn't say it. But in Atlanta, when it came up, underwater was our issue. It cost more to build the home than we could sell it for. Today, our neighborhoods are, gentrifying or displacing or whatever. That's no longer the issue. They are appraising. There are market comps. So we're going to be talking to folks about how do you tweak it so that it does work in Atlanta, Georgia. We need tools for home ownership affordable, but we particularly need it for wealth and the racial wealth gap in Atlanta. The good news is things are going up. So our 700 homeowners, those have been in more than 5 years, which is the majority, they have $130,000 of wealth, and their rent isn't going up, except for the taxes and the insurance are going up. We saw this mortgage, but the mortgage didn't. So we need more of those tools. We and Habitat are the two largest builders in entry level. And I think not-for-profits in that entry level space have been playing a larger share because you don't make the 20% markup, right? We just want to break even and do it again.
Let's talk a little bit about what happens, Nishu, when either a Pretium or a smaller investor goes to sell their properties. They're no longer needed. They have, the affordability or the long-term provisions of making money from them have sort of lost their purpose. Are there any current models? We talked, or somebody mentioned the First Look program. I know that exists in certain states where when an investor is ready to sell, they can offer it for sale to a nonprofit partner or to the resident in those communities. Do we have current programs that exist today in that way?
Sure. So with it being such a new industry, and with scale, the ability to consider so many different ways to make sure that the choice that our residents are making to rent is a part of a broader spectrum of what they might do down the line. There's so many different ideas that have been discussed. Obviously, the rent-to-own model, the shared home price appreciation model, in terms of when we're selling first look programs, to residents or to be working with other organizations, where the home, might be suitable for a not-for-profit. So the Isuzu program was the one that we identified, and again, my colleague Tatiana can go into much more detail about this than I can, but that was the decision that we made, was that is the best way to impact the broadest number of our tenants, and really to not just empower those tenants with the ability to, down the road, to potentially become homeowners, but access to credit cards, better rates on auto lending. The credit score is used as shorthand for so much in our lives these days that we felt that was, and we've had, I think, a 95% plus take-up rate in terms of people voluntarily participating in it. And so that's been the kind of most impactful thing. But to rent to own, I think, again, that's some folks have pursued that. That was not what we chose. But yeah, that's been a kind of how we've been thinking about it.
I want to just add one thing. So when Ingrid, and a lot of the policy recommendations on the last page, on my last slide, came from the paper that Ingrid Gould-Ellen and I wrote. We actually thought about, should we mandate first look programs for institutional investors? And in the end decided that it was counterproductive. That is, we're both fans of first look programs when Fannie and Freddie sell one by one, or FHA. It's been, they've been very, very successful. But with institutional investors, a lot of the selling is bulk portfolios. That's just a lot harder to do under a first look program. So it's something that we had actually considered as a recommendation and then decided against it.
Well, perhaps it doesn't have to be either. Perhaps there can be something in between.
It fits into Nishu's point that they decided that was probably not one of the most impactful things they could do.
But speaking of bulk purchases, right? I mean, you're remiss not to mention Cincinnati and my friend Laura Bruner at the port, who was able to do a bulk purchase as a public entity, as a redevelopment authority of a distressed portfolio of single family, and is working now to bring those properties to market, as a not-for-profit entity. And so I think one of the things, to kind of follow John's point, that we want to think about at the level of policy is how are we giving more supports to the nonprofit developer sector. And that is going to unlock affordable opportunities for families if we're serious about closing the racial wealth gap, if we're serious about stabilizing neighborhoods. And it's not necessarily, we will always have rental, we will always need rental, but as we work to increase supply, how can we also bolster the capacity of local nonprofits who are often in the gap there, providing opportunities that the market, just for for a variety of reasons, isn't able to create.
Well, one of the things from the pandemic that we learned, the Emergency Rental Assistance Program provided sort of critically needed resources, one-time resources, emergency assistance to help people stay afloat and pay their rents on time. What are some other models? We short of asking for a universal voucher or something that would help really address the income side, in addition to the supply side of the equation. Are there other models where we can sort of look to better partnerships with housing authorities, for example, to ensure that as voucher holders are looking for places to go, that these single-family rental properties are options for them? How do we, and where is that happening? So I don't know. Go ahead, John.
Yeah, so vouchers are often underutilized, and many families prefer to live in a single-family home. So your group and mine have part of their business. We're reaching that market, and if you do it well and you get to know the housing authority, some of the economics can actually work. But we need relationships with folks so we can help that. That is, if you're renting a home, it's great to try to serve that below 60% AMI family. So then we just need more vouchers, whether you want multifamily or single-family rental, and I think that's the start. That's an existing program that could be better utilized for this housing stock.
And I think some partnerships there potentially between
Exactly.
the large mega
got it.
investors, housing authorities around the country. There are programs like the Section 8 for homeownership program, for example, that could be used should a family want to be on a pathway to homeownership. Yet those players don't traditionally talk to each other. And I know that's not, Pretium has done a great job and is doing some outreach working with housing authorities. I think many of you have voucher holders in many of your units, if I'm not mistaken.
So we have 2,000 households that are Housing Choice voucher households, and it's a very important part. My colleague Andrea heads she's here today as well, she heads our affordable housing initiative. It is a very important part of our future. The affordable housing discussion generally was what our thought process has typically been focused primarily on the multifamily side of things. I've had some very interesting conversations with Andrea. She's approached a lot of the public housing authorities. Some of the questions we get, what's the class rating of this portfolio of single-family homes that you would like to fit under our affordable housing program? We say, well, that doesn't apply in single-family homes. That's an apartment concept, and the scattered versus. So it's something that we're very actively pursuing, and the 1 out of 7 vouchers that aren't used due to lack of available homes that where they could be used, and so we see that as a very important part of addressing the need for affordable housing, particularly the single-family homes where tenants can have the greatest opportunity. So that's a big focus for us.
One thing I'll get, the portfolios, right? One of the issues is the mom and pop lawyer doctor would sell no more than 6 homes at a time because that's all they could get from Fannie or Freddie. Now they're selling this big portfolios. Is there a way some of the buyers might not want the voucher piece? So can we get a big enough capital where we buy that voucher, existing voucher tenants who likely would be displaced, and we or another mission-oriented could come in? So I think we have to, how do you break up that portfolio and be smart about it that it makes sense for all players?
I think that's great. We didn't talk much about renter protections. I know there's some discussion. Director Thompson talked a little bit about that. Any thoughts on how we ensure, as we're moving to scale, we've got this affordability issue. We also want to make sure that renters are helping to build wealth and access to the programs that we've talked about here, but just also ensuring that there's some equity in the playing field and that we're providing notice, for example, those kinds of things. Any comments, closing thoughts just on renter protections or?
So I think there's a lot of things that large operators can do far more economically than smaller operators, and I think Nishu hit on a lot of them. Things like the rent reporting, accepting the housing choice vouchers, providing some notice before you do an eviction filing. I mean, those are all things that large guys can do much more easily, and I would argue they should be required to do, and many already are.
So carrots and sticks, some incentives and also some requirements.
Yes, I mean, I think scale should bring additional requirements, but the requirements are things that scale helps you meet.
And I think the transparency that Lori began with, and as far as we need to understand who the owners are, and you talk about mega investors versus mom and pop investors, and I'm sure there's a lot of variation, in that spectrum, and so it's it can be difficult just looking at property records to understand what's behind an LLC. If it's not a mega portfolio, there are other levels there that it can be difficult to understand where the ownership actually lies. And so bringing that kind of transparency in can be a benefit for tenants as they seek recourse efficiently and effectively, as they're renting.
All right, we've got a couple of minutes. You guys, any closing thoughts as we consider the the future of this affordability challenges? We've got a national election coming up in a year from now. What are the thoughts if you had, sort of 3 wishes, 3 things that you would ask Congress and the new administration to focus on, either in this space or to address our nation's affordable housing crisis? What might they be?
So mine would be a neighborhood homes that was a little bit more broader and served geographies that just weren't underwater, but maybe had historic, racial wealth gap issues as well.
I would echo that. I think neighborhood homes is in a previous life. I ran a redevelopment authority in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, which is not a major market. It's not booming or anything. It's like most of America, right? And it is a tale of two cities. And we have a large side of town that you don't have to go to. And there are blocks and blocks and blocks of vacant properties as we have an affordable housing issue in that community. So bringing those properties to market, I know firsthand, could be transformational for communities that don't have the market dynamics of the large urbans, but definitely struggle with the equity issues, struggle with neighborhood stabilization issues, struggle with affordable housing issues that I think this act can really help advance.
Great. Any other closing comments?
And I would just plea on the renovation financing system. I think our renovation financing system is just horribly, horribly broken. I think that we're sort of looking to patch it in some sense, and what we really need to do is think about redoing it. So think about a world in which the renovator, that is the manager of the renovations, actually is responsible for both the does the renovation at a fixed price and is responsible for quality, rather than having the borrower or the lender, neither of whom have any expertise whatsoever, do it. And I'm thinking about like Detroit's Rehab and Ready program as a model, even though that was a philanthropic effort. You could perhaps expand that to be you could actually make that a system that does not require subsidy, where essentially the loan, you can sort of think about how to re-engineer the system so that the construction manager is essentially responsible for the quality of the repairs coming in on price at a fixed cost.
Maybe the industry wants to step in to take on some of these repairs, because you seem to be doing them at scale and in an efficient way.
Yeah, I mean, I would echo, what my fellow panelists are saying. I would argue that maybe in this country it's become harder to build single-family homes than it has to build multifamily homes. Now, that sounds like a crazy thing to say, because obviously putting up an apartment building is a lot harder than putting up a single-family home. But there are so many layers of regulations and other barriers that have built up over time. To me, it really looks like single-family housing is headed towards becoming a luxury good. And the average new house that's built is 2,800 square feet, right, Lori? I don't remember the exact statistic, but it's gotten very large, and it just keeps getting larger over time. If you look at the American Housing Survey, remodeling has become really just something that higher income households do, and we have a really aging housing stock. So there are so many solutions to kind of bring more investment to housing, whether it be the Neighborhood Housing Investment Act, the ADU law that was passed in California, light touch density to encourage more missing middle, duplexes, triplexes, and quads. So there's a lot of different ways. I think increasing in terms of build to rent. So I think it'll take a lot more than just one idea, but that the need and the complexity of adding investment to the single family side of things is a much bigger challenge, and I think one that's been thought about less over time than on the multifamily side.
There's a new pro-housing program that was mentioned earlier today. It was $85 million in last year's budget, and I think somewhere around $100 million. And it essentially is trying to break down regulatory barriers at the local level and incentivize new partnerships coming up. Maybe this is something we could throw in the mix for HUD to consider as it's thinking about new programs like pro-housing. And I think we're way out of time. I thought this was going to stop, but it just keeps going.
Keeps
I think
going.
we're 7 minutes over time. So
I didn't know, trying to look up
yeah.
as more time. I'm like,
Thank you very much to our esteemed panelists and all of you.
Good job.